Dragon Quest has been a series that has influenced and has made a great impact on console RPGs, especially for its time. In the 80s, a couple of guys, Yuji Horii and Koichi Nakamura, were fans of the Wizardry and Ultima series. Horii wanted to create an RPG that was more accessible and simpler to the wider audience, as Japanese RPGs, or JRPGs for short, were still in its infancy stages. One that didn't rely on being familiar with Dungeons and Dragons mechanics, which were and still are popular for its time. Horii also wanted to build on the storytelling from one of his other games, the Portopia serial murder case. So Horii and Nakamura, working at Chunsoft, whom the latter is president of, developed the first Dragon Quest in 1986, which was published by Enix in Japan, and by Nintendo when the game came out in North America in 1989 as Dragon Warrior, as to avoid copyright infringement. The North American release came about under the supervision of Satoru Iwata, with help from Yuji Horii. Other major players in the Dragon Quest franchise has been the series' Japanese artist Akira Toriyama, who most people would know very well for the Dragon Ball series, and series composer Koichi Sugiyama, who had approached Enix by sending them a letter about a shogi PC game. Sugiyama was already a well-known and established composer, and staff at Enix were shocked that Sugiyama had even written to them, let alone shown appreciation of video games, and had asked him to compose the score for Dragon Quest. The original opening theme only took Sugiyama 5 minutes to compose, and his experience in composing music for TV and jingles for commercials attributed to this, and the opening has stood the test of time. Fast forward 32 years later, and the Dragon Quest series has established itself as a very important franchise, and is one of the inspirations for the now popular JRPG genre. While Nakamura and Chunsoft helped develop the first 5 games in the series, the trio that is designer and writer Yuji Horii, artist Akira Toriyama, and composer Koichi Sugiyama have become the staple to the development of the series and its spin-offs. But enough on the history lesson, the main focus here is on the 11th installment of the main series. Now, the Japanese and English versions of the game have different names for people and places, so for the sake of this review I'll use the English names. In Dragon Quest XI, you play as a young man you can name raised in the village of Cobblestone. The opening to the game establishes that the hero is of royal blood, and after completing his coming-of-age ceremony alongside his childhood friend Gemma by reaching the top of Cobblestone Tor and having his latent powers awaken, the hero is told that he is the reincarnation of the Luminary, a legendary hero destined to defeat the evil plaguing the land. He is then told to go to the neighbouring kingdom of Heliodor to meet with the king, as the king could provide more information. However, the hero's audience with the king isn't exactly the most pleasant of encounters, and after meeting a fellow prisoner in the castle's dungeons and escaping from the guards, the hero, whom I'll now refer to as the Luminary's adventure, begins. Along the way he'll meet valuable allies and encounter dangerous enemies in his long quest to bring peace back to the land of Erdrea. But is the game any good? Find out in The Good. I found the game's story, though having parts that were somewhat predictable from a mile away, was one of the reasons why I was drawn to the Dragon Quest games in general. The characters in the world of Erdrea I also feel helped shape the game's story and made the Luminary's journey more worthwhile. Some NPCs may have quests for the Luminary to complete, and I like how it provides a little bit of insight into the lives of the average everyday person. Some of the locations in Erdrea seem to draw inspiration from different parts of the world, and these locations tend to have their own quirks, such as the inhabitants of Hotto, a Japanese-inspired town speaking in haikus, or Gondolia drawing inspiration from Italy and giving its inhabitants a bit of the Italian accent. The game's NPCs certainly build up the world and adds a bit of weight to the Luminary's plight. The side quests are completely optional, and sometimes the rewards can be quite well worth it. On the story itself, while there are parts I could see from a mile away, without spoiling anything, the story itself still manages to hold a few surprises for me, and as serious as the Luminary's journey is, the cast of characters which builds his party certainly adds a bit of humour and lightheartedness to the tale. I'm looking at you, Rab. I found the characters in the Luminary's party to be likeable, and some of the characters have their own development plots which make them feel more like companions rather than strangers who just decided to join the Luminary because he's the Luminary. The game's world is another thing I really liked about Dragon Quest XI. The world of Erdrea is a very large place, and the Luminary gets a little taste of this once he obtains a ship, with the rest of the world being available by ship later in the story. As I mentioned earlier, locations in the game draw inspiration from real-life cultures, and this is reflected by the visuals of the location and the speech patterns of its inhabitants. Once you get even further into the game, you'll gain access to another method of transportation that will allow you to visit some normally inaccessible parts of the map for more valuable items. The spell Zoom, which the Luminary can learn, is a staple part of the Dragon Quest games, and the Luminary can cast it at no cost to travel to places that he's already visited, and for completing the game you'll find yourself using zoom a lot. Admittedly, I was a little disappointed that you can use it inside buildings, caves and dungeons now, as part of the charm to using zoom inside some places from previous games is that you would hit your head on the ceiling and the spell wouldn't work. The game's mechanics is something that makes Dragon Quest XI a very accessible game for newcomers as well as veterans. Battles are turn-based and players have all the time in the world to choose their next move, and spells have brief descriptions in case you want to know what they do. The turn-based mechanics have been a staple of Dragon Quest ever since the very beginning, with the exception of Dragon Quest X, but that's an MMO, and the series is known to sticking with its core mechanics and playing it safe to a fault. Characters can power up in battle and enter a state known as pepped up, which temporarily increases their stats, and allow characters to perform pep powers with other characters. Sometimes both or multiple characters need to be pepped up at the same time, other times a power may only need one character pepped up. Other things from previous entries in the series make a return, such as collecting mini medals and turning them in for prizes, and the casino, which is a very dangerous place to be. The gambling addiction is very real. A more recent addition is crafting. A feature that appeared in Dragon Quest VIII as the alchemy pot returns as the fun-sized forge, which is more focused on crafting and enhancing gear. This encourages you to explore every nook and cranny as well as check out shops all around the world in order to get the materials that you need. Once you've successfully created an item, you'll receive Perfectionist Pearls, which you can use to enhance your gear. The more powerful the gear, the more pearls are required. Thankfully, if you craft more difficult or more powerful gear, you'll get more pearls out of it. Another thing they've added in with this installment are crossbow targets. Later in the game, the Luminary is given a crossbow to shoot targets down all around the world. If he successfully clears out an area by shooting the 5 targets in the area, he'll be awarded with ability enhancing seeds and materials, which are very handy if you want to give your characters a bit of that extra boost. Despite all this, Dragon Quest XI is not the perfect game, so let's talk about what wasn't so good with the bad. For anyone wondering, I'll address the elephant in the room regarding the game's music in the opinion. As I mentioned earlier, Dragon Quest sticks to its core mechanics and plays it safe to a fault. One of these faults is giving the player a choice of the traditional Dragon Quest battle layout and one where the characters have some freedom of movement. The thing I found with this mode is that the freedom of movement feels more of an illusion, as it doesn't really change anything in the long run. You could start running away from an enemy as they chase after you to hit you and still get hurt despite the enemy hitting at nothing. You can run around behind the enemy to attack and have it provide no extra benefit. I just feel that there wasn't really a need to have this feature added in if it's only cosmetic. If there are benefits, then the differences are either subtle enough for me not to notice, or I haven't come across them in the 140 or so hours I've put into this game. Although the battle system is fine as it is, I wouldn't mind if they tried some new things out and maybe have the battle feel more involved if you decide to use the free roaming battle system. Some of the game's side quests I found could be time consuming or very annoying. One quest in particular in the game requires you to hit jackpot on a roulette table. Despite talking to the girl next to the jackpot and having her tell you that she feels the jackpot could be won really soon, I still spent a little over 2 hours sitting at a roulette table before I won it. The jackpot has to be won by spending a bet on a number, no choosing all black numbers, red numbers, odds or evens, etc. You need to have a bet on an individual number. Thankfully, you can have a bet on every single individual number on the board and it counts. If you win, you essentially get all your coins back unless you put a bet on the treasure chest, which acts as the zero in roulette and provides a lower payout if struck compared to a bet on every single number. To win the jackpot, the ball must not only land on your number, but also line up with the jackpot pointer at the top of the table, which also needs to glow. It feels like the planets need to be aligned in order for you to complete this side quest. To tease you even more, things like this also happen. Other ones may require you to defeat an enemy using certain pep powers or skills, and early on in the game when you don't have any items that can do this, waiting for the appropriate characters to pep up and making sure they're all pepped up at the same time can be annoying. Thankfully, you can switch out a character from your reserve characters and they'll stay pepped up until such a time you need it, and the Luminary can learn a skill where he can pep himself up. Later on in the game you can get pep pips, which can induce pep in a single character, or pep pops, which will do the whole party. Complaints aside, those were the only huge issues I had with the game, so with that it's time to move on to the opinion. Before I get on with it, let's address the complaints I've been hearing and reading about the music. So for anyone who isn't familiar, Dragon Quest VIII when released internationally for the PlayStation 2 had a symphonic soundtrack, whereas the Japanese release of the game had MIDI music. Dragon Quest VII on the 3DS was the opposite. Japan got the symphonic soundtrack and International got MIDI. For 11, both Japanese and international releases got MIDI music. The fact that the soundtrack is MIDI has upset a lot of fans, and modders have even gone as far as modding the PC release to use the symphonic soundtrack over the MIDI. My personal opinion, having played all the main series games to date with the exception of 10, is that I don't mind the MIDI music. I've heard the argument that MIDI on a game with these sorts of visuals is jarring, but I think the mix fits fairly well. Dragon Quest XI also wants to bring the nostalgia factor to its audience, and a good chunk of its music are actually from other Dragon Quest games. I've especially noticed this with the amount of Dragon Quest III and V music, which is good as those are my favourite games in the series. I've listened to both the symphonic and MIDI renditions, and it might be because I've gotten used to it and have grown up listening to Dragon Quest music, but I think the MIDI music sounds fine. Sugiyama may have some spicy controversial opinions and royalties may have played a factor in the symphonic soundtrack not being used, but I'll share the unpopular belief that the MIDI music sounds fine and people are just making a mountain out of a molehill. The music in this case doesn't directly affect how the game plays, but I can respect the opinion that the atmosphere is certainly different by changing the music, and I'll admit that maybe nostalgia goggles blinding and influencing my stance on the music here. The game's soundtrack aside, what did I think of the game? Overall, Dragon Quest XI has been an absolute delight to play. I spent a little over 140 hours playing through the game, stopping once I got the Platinum Trophy as I was playing it on the PlayStation 4. The game has excellent visual appeal and is easily one of the prettier JRPGs I've looked at to date. Dragon Quest XI's story, characters and world tied in with its game mechanics are the game's strongest points. Ironically, sticking to those mechanics and playing it safe is a minor fault alongside time-consuming and annoying side quests, but the experience I had playing Dragon Quest XI was a great one. Without spoiling much, the game also has some really good post-game content, so once you've beaten the big bad, definitely check it out. This is certainly what post-game content should be. I didn't particularly mind the accents present in the game. I think that's a part of its charm, and trying to read out lines in my head with a Cockney British accent, such as, and I do apologise for my terrible attempt at an accent, "You what? You wanna borrow me dog? You're having a giraffe, ain't you? Look, I ain't got time for this, go on, sling your hook." Just a reminder that the first Dragon Quest game, Dragon Warrior on the NES used Elizabethan English, such as, "Thy hit points have decreased," so it isn't something particularly new. If you're a fan of JRPGs, then Dragon Quest XI is a game you have to try out. After Dragon Quest III and V, 11 can comfortably take third place in my list of best Dragon Quest games. So with that, it's time for my rating. I would give, and I do apologise I haven't actually used its full name until now, Dragon Quest XI, Echoes of an Elusive Age, a hearty hand. No, make that 2 hearty hands, out of 10. Thanks for watching and stay tuned for the next Infinite Backlog review. If you enjoyed today's review, feel free to check out some of our other videos and subscribe for more. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram and our Facebook page. Once again, thank you for watching.